So thank you all for joining us today. To begin with, I would like to introduce who I am, so you know who's speaking. She'e bilagana nishle, do kiaani bashishchin, bilagana dashuche, do sinajini dashanale, akut egwat sa nishle, Farina King yinishye. Yate, hello, it is good to be with you here today. I am of white English settler descent through my mother, Bilagana, and I'm born for the Towering House Clan and Blackstreet Woods people of Dene, and I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. My name is Farina King. I'm an associate professor and Horizon Chair of Native American Ecology and Culture at the University of Oklahoma in Caddo country, and of a place of many different peoples, of 39 federally recognized tribes there in Oklahoma, where I'm coming from. But today I stand on the grounds of Shoshone, Ute, Goshute, and Paiute lands that have been these indigenous lands since time immemorial, on the campus of University of Utah, near a place that Salt Lake, known for Salt Lake City, is a very sacred place, important place of convergences of many different peoples over generations. And I am honored and grateful to be here and to be on this space with you all. I'll share with you the statement from the University of Utah, their Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. And I know a scholar, Nick Estes, has been said, it's been told that he said something to this effect of land acknowledgements we have to be critical about as well, since it can sometimes be like a thief steals a bike and is riding away with that bike and says, "Oh, thank you for the bike. I recognize this is your bike, but I'm running off with it anyway." So when I share these land acknowledgements, I still think they are essential to share, because as I've realized, there's many people who don't even know that bike was stolen, and they don't even know the names of these peoples and the lands in this history. So this is the University of Utah Land Acknowledgement that I share with them and you all today. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland, and I'll add more than past tense, it is currently. Homeland of Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And only recently was it announced that the University of Utah is waiving tuition for members of the 8 federally recognized tribal nations in the state of Utah. And it is commendable and very exciting news to see different states doing that. I'm hoping Oklahoma may one day do that too, the 39, and more work to be done. Yeah, thank you. Exciting news, very exciting. And so it is an honor and wonderful to be here and recognize that there's so many people who made this gathering happen. Why are we here today? This is a part of a public session of actually a closed workshop. So there was a call for proposals for participants to submit abstracts and proposals of research work that they are doing for educational purposes, for envisioning public audiences with their different projects. It could be future publications, student papers, dissertations, documentaries, or fictional writing. It was pretty open to what were these different works, but related to this theme that has brought a lot of different responses to it. But it is a theme of indigenous perspectives on the meanings of Lamanite. And this workshop, in many ways, you could switch out that that term Lamanite with even the Book of Mormon itself. So some background about this that has been shared in the call for papers that went out to the public, and what brought different proposals, their submissions in, is this description. The Book of Mormon styles itself as a record written to the Lamanites, descendants of the house of Israel who left Jerusalem and populated the Americas as millennia before the arrival of Europeans. Later followers of Joseph Smith expanded the category to include peoples of the Pacific. Since Smith's day, Latter-day Saints have used the term Lamanite to make sense of the world and to assign space in various religious frameworks for peoples indigenous to the Americas and the Pacific. And that is including people of indigenous European and indigenous Black heritage from Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. This has served to attract people to and repel people from Smith's movements, inasmuch as Lamanite works as a term of liberation as well as a constraint. We are forming a community of scholars and intellectuals to address the category, this term Lamanite, centering on indigenous voices concerned with questions of identity, race, religion, settler colonialism, politics, and the relation of Lamanite to other facets of life. This will be a space inclusive of not only the dominant approaches that you see in academia and scholarship, but also, more importantly, indigenous methodologies and protocols from the communities in which these scholars are rooted, making this a community, a first of its kind. To accomplish this, this is a part of why we're here today. This workshop is developing shared spaces for scholars to reflect on these issues, collaborate with each other, and share their scholarship with larger audiences like we are doing today. As I said earlier, this would not be possible without the scholars who come forward. And when you come forward in this work, it's a form of vulnerability, putting your name out there and sharing that. That is why most of the workshop meeting today and tomorrow is closed, because this is work in progress. And we want to ensure a safe space for these scholars to have these difficult conversations, as many of them come from positionalities that are deeply tied personally, to these dynamics. So also, this would not be possible without the many partners and all the support that we've received from people who may be joining us online today or are here with us in person. And I certainly have to begin with recognizing, the University of Utah and our partners here that opened this space for us to meet, have this opportunity. And that included the American West Center of the University of Utah. Michelle Judd and Greg Smote have been invaluable in their support, and Dr. Paul Reeve of the History Department and a focus on Mormon Studies here, as well as the Laura F. Wills Center for Book of Mormon Studies and the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies and the Department of History at Brigham Young University. They also contributed much to this gathering, and it would not happen without their support. Other sponsors who also came together, and this was remarkable, as we had nearly 20 different partners come in and support in different ways. Groups from all over the country and world include the Department of History and Mormon Studies at Utah State University, or I should say Mormon Studies at Utah State University, Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, Signature Books, the Center for the American West at the University of Colorado Boulder, Sunstone, the Mormon History Association, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, the Museum of Mormon History of the Americas, the National Museum of American Religion, Global Mormon Studies, Mormon Social Science Association, the Utah Division of State History, Mormon Studies at the University of Virginia, and other partners and scholars, again, as I said, from throughout the world. I also want to thank a Dene artist and close friend of mine who goes by the artist name M. Nasba for her artistic work that has contributed to the different flyers and call for proposals and the conversations she had in support of this workshop. Ahyehe, mahalo. Without further ado, I'll turn the time to the co-director of this workshop with me, Dr. Michael Ng, who can briefly introduce himself, and who you have come here to listen to today, our keynote speaker, Dr. Ignacio Garcia. Ahyehe, thank you.
Mahalo yaoi, Farina. I'm very glad to be here, and it's my honor today to introduce our speaker. I'll maybe forego with some of my own introductions, except to say that I'm raised by the Aina of Manoa on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. And I currently reside on the land of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Delaware, where I work at the University of Indiana, or Indiana University in the Department of Religious Studies. Dr. Ignacio Garcia is the Lemuel Hardison Red Jr. Professor of Western and Latino History at Brigham Young University. He is the author of 7 books on Mexican American and Latino civil rights, the Chicano movement, and Mexican American politics. His memoir, Chicano While Mormon, speaks to the challenges of being an activist and a faithful member of the LDS Church. He has also written numerous articles on essays on Latinx religious experience in the Southwest. He's a former president of the Mormon History Association and a current board member of the Utah State History Division, as well as an editorial board member of several national and international journals. Dr. Garcia was born in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico, and came to the United States in the mid-1950s. He served as a combat medic in the 477th Medical Detachment in the US Army and did a tour in Vietnam in 1971 to 1972. Dr. Garcia has also served as an LDS bishop and worked as a news correspondent, sports writer, and editor before starting work in the academy. We are honored that he is here with us today to share his important work and his fascinating life in his search for a Lamanite identity. Please, Dr. Garcia.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I would love to speak to you in my native language, indigenous language, but I was part of a very colonized community, so I can't speak it. I can speak to you in Spanish, but I do want to add one thing when we do land acknowledgement. According to Mexican anthropologists and Aztec folklore, this is also the land of the Aztecs. So we are somewhere connected there too here. And so I'm grateful to be here to as we used to say, Chicano activists was to say, to the northern reaches of Aztlan. And so I'm very grateful. Having been in this sort of earlier discussion, it really just comes across how many fault lines there are in this discussion of Lamanite identity, and how incredibly wonderful to hear so many different views, so much passion, so much, and to see the tears that come, because in essence, this is a very difficult identity. I was telling one of the people that I met in this conference that we're all a lot nicer, because when Chicano activists used to get together to talk about identifying themselves and about what Chicano meant as an identity, there was always, chairs flying and loud words. And then after the conference, they'd continue that in the streets and in the bars, cafes, wherever. So I'm hoping that no one will throw a chair and that no one will say things about my mother or whatever. So again, thank you. I don't remember the first time I really paid attention to the word Lamanite and what it meant to me then as a personal identifier. No doubt it was probably during Sunday school at the 4th Ward, deep in the west side of San Antonio, which used to be called Mexican Town. Just as probable was that I first took notice of it because it meant something to one of those wonderful and caring teachers that I had back then. No doubt that discussion or discussions, because there were many of them, dealt with, as it always did among us Mexican Lamanites, with the promises of the Book of Mormon to indigenous people and to those of us who descended from them, as we believed all Mexicans did. Our congregation was a mixture of immigrants, resident aliens, and Mexicans who were born in this country, and those who had crossed illegally. It was working class, mostly Spanish speaking, and almost all first-generation Latter-day Saints. We lived in one of the largest segregated areas in the Southwest, in supposedly a bicultural city, though we all knew it was anything but that. Mexicans were to stay on their side of town, provide cheap labor, and vote for the right gringo or white politician assigned to our part of town by the Good Government League, which controlled city politics. Our small member-constructed chapel was our oasis from poverty, limited schooling, and the vices and violence that seemed to concentrate on our side of town. Most of my adult leaders were not sophisticated in the ways of the world, but most understood that our problems on our side of town were due to our marginalization, and the only way out was to be a good member of the church and wait for promises to be fulfilled. The notion of a Lamanite, which was imposed on us, or as some of you might say, was part of our colonization, nevertheless provided us a safe space. It wasn't something thoroughly thought out. It was a gut reaction that had formed from our readings of the Book of Mormon stories of brave and faithful people with brown skin. These stories were an emotional refuge to a people who on the outside had no written history, no heroes, no literature, and no timeline to provide us a perspective of whom we were. Outside of our ward, we were dirty Mexicans, treacherous, smelly, dumb, and racially inferior to whites, or strange, weird teetotalers and non-Catholic heretics to our Mexican neighbors. For me and many, though not all members of my congregation, was a fierce but shallow Lamanite identity, and it was a conduit to our Mexicanness into the church, because being Lamanite made it appropriate to celebrate Mexican holidays, music, culture, and to tell stories and talk about things germane to us. Since white leaders did not know what Lamanite culture was, they defaulted to us, and so we did our thing. Luckily for me, the future Chicano activist, my ward never sang, danced, or cooked food for our white brothers and sisters. Sharing of my substance with white saints has never been a problem for me, but I do not perform for them. And when I was bishop of a ward in Tucson, Arizona, I eliminated the fiesta the ward had for stake members. I offered them a lot of other things, but not food, dance, or song. When asked at BYU if the club I advised would dance and sing for the other students, I said no. I've never judged others who chose to do these things for their white religious siblings, but I had simply no tradition of it, and I saw no reason to start one. Most of my fellow congregants accepted their indigenous roots by simply accepting their Lamanite identity. For some, it did not go further than that. For others, it did. There is no doubt that this religious identity that I grew up with is much more diffuse today. And some of our youth now reject the term. In this, they are encouraged by Mormon intellectuals, mostly white, though not all, obsessed with fighting colonialism, though they themselves have little real understanding of what it means and how it feels to be colonized. They are colonized by proxy, and that is not the same. I never criticize my people who use the term, nor have I tried too hard to decipher the line that divides the term into colonizing and empowering parts. In this, I'm probably not much different from some of you, and many of my Lamanite brothers and sisters with whom I worship. The term Lamanite, in my view, was never meant to provide a history lesson, nor to define us in the outside world. For church leaders and missionaries, it was meant to tie indigenous people to the Book of Mormon and thus make it easier to convert them. For many of us, it meant we had a religious collective bond with others like us. We were brown brothers and sisters in a white church, and we had a promise of good things to come. No doubt that the idea of Lamanite has varied meanings depending on the space we occupy and the circumstances in which we find ourselves. The flexibility, or better said, fluidity of the term has us here, believers and not, self-proclaimed Lamanites and those who have left the name and its church behind, and those who rejected it from the start but could not fully escape its implications. Some see it as a sign of God's love, and others as one more example of the settler state. But regardless of which side we stand in this debate, we must all admit that we need to know more about what this identity means to our people. We may debate the use of the term, disagree on its roots, deconstruct its meaning, but unless we begin developing a history, a sociology, and a theological essence for that identity, we will have wasted our time here. Never has something like this been put together, at least that I know of. And we have Farina, Michael, Robert, others, and you to thank for this. The theme of this workshop, Indigenous Perspectives on the Meaning of Lamanite, is a call to think, reflect, ponder, discuss, debate, historicize, and come to some general consensus of how we who identify as Lamanites can develop, and in some instances have, a perspective on whom we are, how the people we grew up with saw themselves, and how that view has both meshed with or pushed against what the Gentiles, in this case the white Mormons, some who loved us, some who didn't or don't, others who simply tolerate the Book of Mormon call to carry us on their shoulders, think of us. The concept of a Lamanite is so complicated and in some ways toxic that in some places we cease to exist except in a Sunday school, relief society, or priesthood class here and there, or among small groups of people like the one a few years ago that gathered my friends in someone's home to talk about the promises to the Mexican Lamanites that President Kimball, but he struck a chord in most of us, had reiterated in a large conference in Mexico City many decades ago. All of that notwithstanding, I believe that we are called to do something much grander in this workshop, which is to expand beyond the literature of lamentation and the rhetoric of rage. They have their place, and they tell us much about our experiences in Mormonism, but they cannot be the bookends to our story. As a young scholar and activist, I made a decision quite early to stop victimizing my people again and again by focusing only on how they suffered, how they were marginalized, and what were their limitations. I understood those, and I didn't and don't ignore them, and have at times struggled to fully forget or forgive those who did this to them or to us. But I chose to look at their will to survive, their resistance to marginalization, their heroes, and their successes wherever I could. I saw them as a people of faith because, and here some of you might strongly disagree, and please do so if you feel, if you don't have faith or once had faith or belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, then you're not a Lamanite, because outside the church, there are no Lamanites. They're just Mexicans, Shoshone, Polynesian, Maori, etc. To constantly condemn the failures of the institution they believe in is to victimize them and to paint them as mindless idiots who seek only to hurt themselves. Condemning their beliefs is not how you study a people, and that is certainly not how you empower them. As an activist scholar and one of faith, I don't do scholarship for any other reason than to empower people. In my youth, the Book of Mormon was my history. It was all I knew about brown people like me because there was no history of us in the public school books or in the church books. To many of us who claimed that term, it was a spiritual history, one in which we had to transcend geography, tribal or ethnic identity, culture, language, and personal or public history to make any sense. I never spent time wondering if it was all factual or even accurate. And as a historian, I've come to understand that no story is fully factual or accurate. It just had to uplift my soul and connect me to the promises of redemption, because my Mexican people needed redemption from poverty, powerlessness, racism, self-hate, and a host of other sins that arose from the conditions placed upon us and the choices we made to survive those conditions. The promises for me were more than about eternal bliss or a mansion in heaven. It was about the now and here. I, like many of those I worship, and I know I'm treading dangerous waters here, so forgive me. I, like many of those I worshiped through the years, and many other Mexicans I came to know, have rarely ever engaged in discussing our Lamanite identity as a colonial designation. Though as Mexicans, we did see ourselves as part of a conquest. Being Lamanite was simply a matter of religious history, and I may add of faith. Having read as much as I could, and having engaged some of you in emailed exchanges while writing this, I acknowledge that there are those who agree and those who adamantly disagree with this view. To some of you, the notion of Lamanite, to paraphrase my dear friend, Elise Boxer, serves simply to silence the voices of indigenous people. I have no problem with that argument as it pertains to some communities, but I do not believe that it holds true in the same way for all communities, because anyone who claims any identity does so in the context of their community's social, political, and cultural history, and their lived experiences and their responses to those experiences. There is no way to judge a Lamanite identity as a collective that applies everywhere. To reduce it to one historical framework or one theoretical perspective is to make all people who claim that identity one-dimensional and to judge them rather than to study them. At this stage, it is also silly, would be silly to argue over meaning. Instead, we should learn from each other about how we've approached understanding our people, because the reality is that we know so much less about our communities as Latter-day Saints or ex-Latter-day Saints than we know of them as members of different indigenous groups. I know some of you are interested in speaking in larger, more global terms and have sought to apply larger theoretical frameworks to the study of them. And that is fine. I am always impressed and inspired by those of you who do that. But as a historian, I find it important to underscore that personal and communal identities are rarely ever learned from a top-down view. Most theories come after spade work, and I can't speak for other communities, but in mine, that work is still missing. I have seen some exceptional scholarly work done on some of our communities, but for the most part, there have been mostly general assessments, case studies here and there, some biographies, and lots of theories, though not enough, in my view, to provide us, to quote the title of this workshop, an indigenous perspective to a Lamanite identity. In that spirit, let me add a grain of sand to this discussion by talking about the saints from south of the border, or those whom, as we Mexicans like to say, the US-Mexican border crossed them. The anthropologist Octavio Romano once wrote that in talking about Mexicans or Mexican Americans, scholars had to take into consideration the indigenous identity that appeared among them in conversations, songs, poems, cultural motifs, and in the common descriptor of the brown young man in most any barrio in the United States, Indio or Indian. He even argued that Chicanos, as part of a larger view of the world, had an Indianist philosophy. Unfortunately, Romano never fully defined what this meant, thus forcing Chicanos intellectuals and activists to spend decades trying to figure it out, and eventually to accept that it would be best expressed through lived experiences, through their art and literature, and most particularly through the writing of their own complicated history. In 1969, Mexican-American activists, now calling themselves Chicanos, came together in Denver, Colorado, to proclaim a Bronze Nation, to affirm their indigenous roots, and to create Aztlan, a mythical, emotional place named after what they believed was the Aztecs' place of origin. In their manifesto, El Plan Espiritual de Aztlan, or the Spiritual Plan of Aztlan, they set in motion a search for their history and their indigenous roots. In doing so, they looked toward Mexican history. Ironically, less than a year later, Spencer W. Kimball, the most significant proponent of the Lamanites as an indigenous people, became president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was the LDS leader most responsible for the growth of the church in Mexico and Latin America, which he saw as the future of the church, claiming that by 1990, Spanish would be the language of the church. President Kimball will be known for both good and bad for his promotion of the concept of the Lamanite and his own introduction of what was happening to our skin as we became obedient. But he was also its greatest defender and one of the few apostles to call out Mormon racism against indigenous people, and he did it numerous times, including at Brigham Young University in the 1950s. His life is a case study in the complicated, contradictory, racialist views of the church on indigenous people. But going back to the Chicanos activist search for their past, Mexico became the place they found indigenous people and their siblings from another father, the mestizos, taking an active role in freeing themselves from colonialism, beginning with the War of Independence, when some of the most important revolutionary leaders were indigenous. Its first president was of Afro-Indigenous descent, and later its most famous president was Benito Juarez, a Zapotec. It was, however, the Mexican Revolution of 1910 that Chicanos were most inspired, because los de abajo, the poor, the indigenous, and the brown, marginalized mestizos made up the largest number of soldiers and leaders seeking to overthrow the dictator Porfirio Diaz, in whose 30-year reign Mexico became dominated by capitalist interests from Great Britain and the US, and who made indigenous people peons. When the Mexican Revolution exploded in 1910, there were already Mexican saints there, and many of them, especially in the southern volcanic regions of the country, chose to side with the revolutionaries, some serving with Emiliano Zapata, the Indio mestizo leader of the southern part of the rebellion. In fact, as Rex Eugene Cooper and Moroni Spencer Hernandez de Olarte tell us, a number of saints came together to create the Zapatista Mormon Battalion and fight in numerous important battles of the revolution. Many of those saints in the South came to view Emiliano Zapata as a kind of Captain Moroni. Now, I know that's probably not the term we would use in our gathering here. Nonetheless, a Captain Moroni fighting for the liberty and rights of the indigenous communities in Mexico. After the revolution, many of these saints strengthened their relationship with the revolutionaries forged during battle, and this led, according to the authors, to the emergence of new native leaders, consolidation those native church leaders called before the revolution, and cemented a relationship between the Mexican Mormons and the revolutionary leaders. In northern Mexico, the situation was different. And the Zapatistas, those who had a lot of Mormon support, created the first Mexican Mormon martyr when they placed Rafael Monroy and Vicente Morales before a firing squad, having accused them of being on the side of another revolutionary group. This revolution caused martyrdom. Nonetheless, strengthened Mexican LDS leadership in the north by forcing them to look to themselves for survival, as white church leaders had been pushed out or hightailed it out because of the threats of a nationalistic Mexican government who wanted no foreigner ministers in their nation. While those in the north also saw themselves as Lamanites, they did not have the same indigenous focus as did those in the south. The revolution also impacted a young indigenous convert by the name of Margarito Bautista, who in a short period of time became a frequent companion to missionaries and to President Ray L. Pratt of the Mexican Mission. He preached powerful sermons, which were much about indigenous Latter-day Saints, and he seemed like a godsend for the missionary work in Mexico. But the revolution pushed him, along with 1 million other more Mexicans, to flee north and into the Mexican barrios of the Southwest. He started out in Mesa, Arizona, but eventually moved to Salt Lake City. There, he, 2 other men, and 3 very incredible women, the Rivera sisters, helped establish the first Spanish language LDS branch in the state. He later returned to Mexico on a genealogical mission, and what he saw in his native country changed his perception of history and the church. In the Mexican Revolution, Margarito saw the fulfillment of the Book of Mormon's promise of the Lamanite blossoming in the latter days. He saw Mexicans, many of indigenous origins, playing critical roles in creating a new nation. And he saw indigeneity as the core of the new Mexican self-identification. He became a strong advocate for indigenous rights. And this, and what he saw as progressive changes in his native country, prompted him to write a history of Mexico based on the Book of Mormon that lauded the nation's indigenous past and its future, though he never mentioned the Book of Mormon itself. Church leaders, uncomfortable with the challenge to the America-centric view of this institution, and of course some of his own doctrinal views, eventually sabotaged the sale and distribution of his book. This and the issue of native church leadership prompted him to promote, along with other Mexican Lamanite saints, gatherings that eventually turned into the Third Convention, whose break with the church caused approximately 1/3 of the membership to leave the church, but not Mormonism. They established the publication Sendero Lamanita, Lamanite Path, sent out missionaries, and constructed their own version of the Latter-day Saint gospel. They invited former revolutionaries to their meeting. In fact, in their initial meeting, the head of the Latter-day Saint revolutionaries sat there in the front row as a special honored visitor. They promoted the idea that Lamanite blossoming had arrived, and the church had to accept the fact. Eventually, most came back, and a number of them became leaders in the church, and they forced the church to establish schools, call more local indigenous Mestizo leaders, and provide resources, though church leaders were slower in providing regional and national indigenous leaders. Over time, white church leaders and their brown allies would help turn the tide against speaking of this important bit of church history. Instead, church leaders and historians would eventually emphasize their leaders' patience, church leaders' patience, the prophet George Albert Smith's visit to Mexico, and his humble invitation for them to come back. Still, a strong sense of indigenous Mestizo nationalism was instilled in many saints there. Another Mexican fleeing the violence was Jose Apolinar Valderas, who settled in El Paso, Texas, converted to the church, became a strong advocate for the Mormon's gospel, served as the first Mexican branch president there, and then later moved to Mexico and befriended Margarito Bautista and other saints who claimed a Lamanite identity, which he did too. His two sons became critical to the Mexican saints north of the border. One, Guillermo, became the first Spanish-speaking Lamanite bishop in the United States and a strong advocate for Lamanite wards. And the other, Eduardo, became the first official LDS church translator, and his work, in my view, makes him the second most important translator in the history of the church. His work, more than any other, would serve to strengthen the identity of Mexican saints as Lamanites, as he translated many works into Spanish as he could, produced a Spanish hymnal, and helped to set up the La Llorona, the first Spanish language magazine of the church. He also became a roving patriarch, traveling to Spanish-speaking countries and providing most church leaders there their patriarchal blessings. And no doubt once there, he spoke about the future of the Lamanite. In this, he was partly helped by then President Spencer W. Kimball, whom he accompanied in numerous visits to Mexico and other Latin American countries, where he preached about the blossoming of the Lamanite. The church's search for the Lamanite was ecclesial, as so much among church members and leaders becomes over time, a concern with doing the church's work above all. The search for the Lamanite that would occupy some dedicated white men and women for their whole life was often sincere, but complicated and often contradictory. Ray L. Pratt, the longest serving mission president among the Mexican people in Mexico and the US, and one of the most beloved of the Mexican saints, revealed this contradiction in an article published in the Improvement Era in 1930 titled "The Gospel to the Lamanites." The article sought to chastise those white saints who did not see the proselyting of Mexicans as a worthy cause. He reminded his readers that the search for the Lamanite was a responsibility of the church from the earliest years of Joseph's ministry. Quote, "And if those who should carry forth the gospel unto the seed of those who wrote it," he declared, "I ask, why are there so many of us who are averse to doing the Father's work among the Lamanites? Why so many young men among us when the subject is mentioned of taking a mission to Mexico, for instance, where millions of the remnants of the seed of Nephi dwell, say, 'Oh, let me go anywhere except Mexico. I wish to go to a country that is civilized and come in contact with people where I can gain an education and polish.'" There was, in the article, no discussion of colonization, violence, conquest, genocide, or racism. The latter, which he directly implied in the article. He simply emphasized the need to save them from their fallen state. Studying his life and that of other such men, there is no doubt that they understood and even at times preached the former. And often, they loved the people. But the sins of Laman and Lemuel informed all things dealing with Lamanites. On June 17, 1951, the Rama Mexicana, or Mexican branch, got its own chapel in Salt Lake City, dedicated by J. Reuben Clark, second counselor in the first presidency. Accompanying him on that momentous occasion was Joseph Fielding Smith, president of the Quorum of the 12, Apostle Spencer W. Kimball, and Matthew Cowley, as well as Anton Ivins and S. Dilworth Young of the presidency of the 70s. In his dedicatory prayer, Elder Clark, speaking of the Mexican saints who would congregate, said, "Let them come with clean hands, pure hearts, that they may put aside all iniquity, that they may cleanse their hearts from any impurities found there. Let not any unclean thing enter this building." While no doubt seeking to emphasize the holiness of the space, it caused this historian to cringe, because back then, when white people thought of Mexicans, they thought of them as unclean and dirty, and they were treacherous, couldn't be trusted. In essence, they had impure hearts. One of the highlights of the dedication was the unveiling of a mural painted on the wall of the chapel, which I thought was a wonderful idea, by L. Goff Dowding, a former white member of the branch, that depicted a defiant and powerful Samuel the Lamanite preaching. Can you imagine that in all of our buildings? Anyway. Though we do not see the Nephites who would be trying to kill him, but that was okay because every Mexican saint knew the story, and they also understood what it meant for them. They were blossoming, even if their distinguished guests could only contemplate a Lamanite future far, far away. Exactly 3 years later, to the day of the dedicatory prayer, hundreds of immigration and law enforcement officers rounded up tens of thousands of Mexican immigrants during Operation Wetback and shoved them into buses, boats, and planes and departed them to often unfamiliar parts of Mexico, disregarding the fact that many of them were American citizens and some of them, maybe many of them, were Latter-day Saints. Today, like then, thousands of saints from Mexico, Central and South America continue to be deported, even as many more continue to make the trek to come not only to America, but to Zion. This anti-immigrant attitude, including among many white Latter-day Saints, has caused many Mexican saints to question their white religious counterparts' allegiance to the Book of Mormon promises. And they have pushed back with comments like those of a Mexican-American member of a stake presidency who said, the Book of Mormon says that no one comes to this nation but by the hand of God. So we are here, we are where we should be. Besides, this is Mexican territory stolen by the white man. Most important, it is indigenous land stolen twice or 3 times over. We too had something to do with that. Members of the Raza of the Rama Mexicana, which now had in its congregation Eduardo Valderas, reveled in their permanent space, and they set out to reaffirm their cultural roots, their history with the celebration of Mexican holidays, and to preach and live a gospel that took into consideration their place in American society as Lamanites. While led for 40 years, very unjustly, I would say, by white leaders, they managed to maintain their sense of Mexicanness and with their Lamanite identity, because that is what bound them to the church and distinguished them from those who did not care for them. Without that difference, Mexican members were unequal in the Mormon kingdom because they occupied a lower level in the pecking order. Being Lamanite did not change their status, their economic situation, or even the perception of their white brothers and sisters. But it gave them their own cultural and theological space. And it was there where people like the Rivera sisters, Margarito Bautista, Eduardo Valderas, Fernando Gomez, Sister Zacarias, my favorite Sunday school teacher of all time, and maybe even Sister Aburto, found the space to blossom. It is the same today in many Spanish language wards and branches throughout the Southwest. Like me, thousands of youth grew up learning about the Lamanite, encouraged to accept the history as a promise. For those of us who bought into this scriptural history, our Lamanite identity was a way to fortify ourselves against the world and to shield ourselves from the prejudices, racism, and indifference of some of our white brothers and sisters in our stakes. It was drilled into our heads that there was a purpose to our differences. It is probably why my 4th ward produced a young man who helped found the first Mexican-American student activist club at BYU, another who became leader in the Raza Unida Party of Texas, and numerous older men and women who became involved in COPS, communities organized for public service. While in the Army, I remember receiving news that my mother, Amada Garcia, and her dear friend, Sister Huerta, and other women in the ward were protesting outside City Hall attending city council meetings and demanding of city officials to build low-cost housing and to put up sidewalks and a drainage system in the west side of San Antonio. From the Lucero ward, which became the successor to the Rama Mexicana, came Orlando Rivera, its first Mexican-American bishop, a founder of one of the first civil rights advocacy groups in Utah, and a proud Chicano. I remember the summer I arrived to assume my position at BYU. He spoke at a conference on diversity, which I missed, unfortunately, and he scolded the church for its failure to meet the needs of its Mexican and Lamanite saints. It was a brave act, to say the least, and his words served as a model for how to speak loudly and clearly to the church of its failures when it came to people of color, if one still wanted to remain a faithful member. At the Y, I met another Mexican-American who profoundly believed in the Lamanite promises. Arturo de Hoyos, a sociology professor and founder of several nonprofit universities for Mexican and Latino students, had dedicated his life to preparing his students for their blossoming. In his book, El Lamanita Mestizo, or the Mestizo Lamanite, he wrote, "This book is dedicated to Lamanite youth of the last days. They will educate themselves and will change the environment in which many of them live, deprived of their identity, ignorant of their mission, and distanced from their glorious destiny." He added that their mission was to save the two nations whose blood runs in their veins. Another BYU graduate who identifies himself as a Lamanite is Fernando Gomez, for whom we will hear a bit later. Fernando, with the able assistance of Ketita, his wife, has done more for Mexican-American Latter-day Saint history than anyone else, and his museum and collection of documents will be a historical beacon for generations to come. I remember as our bishop, our ward hosting over 300 young people from throughout the state of Arizona and northern Mexico, attending our Lamanite youth conferences, which were held for 3 consecutive years. There, these youth learn about their Mexican heritage, their religious identity, and how to prepare to lead their communities and congregations. Today, there are hundreds of youth in Spanish language wards and branches, and there is a growing number of them attending BYU. Like one great student over there. It is there that some are discovering their Latino indigenous heritage. Some by remembering what their elders taught them, and others learning it for the first time through our Latino history classes and our Latino civil rights seminar. Later in the workshop, we will hear from one of those incredible young women. For many Mexican saints, indigenous and mestizo members, the Lamanite identity is very much woven into their lived experiences as brown people, both in their country and the United States. It is what makes them both similar and different from other communities in which the name Lamanite was bestowed. We cannot understand what Lamanite means to a Mexican saint unless we learn the story of resistance, of internal community building, of survival, and of aspirations for a better future. As a young boy growing up poor and brown in San Antonio, Texas, becoming Lamanite was a matter of survival. Over time, as a Chicano activist, I came to better understand my religious identity. My lived experiences, to quote one of my students, has helped me fill in many things missing in my Lamanite identity. Many of you who have read my work know that I have written about Latino saints' struggles against the prejudices they confront and the many things still to be resolved in their religious space they've chosen to occupy. There's much to be said about that, and I'm sure it will be. But I add on a personal note that there are so few of us today willing to talk about the Mexican Lamanite that it can be exhausting. Fernando and I have spent many hours talking about this and lamenting that we are getting up in years, or maybe he's getting up in years, I'm still young. And there are very few intellectuals, writers, and leaders in our community who can take up the fight. This might be the clearest example of our marginalization. As the biggest group of self-identifying Lamanites, too many of us have been convinced or lulled away from speaking or writing about our history. And while we might practice our identity within the confines of our wards, branches, and homes, we're not leaving enough of a record for those who come after or who are already with us in this journey. Clearly, we need more Guadalupe Monroys, Hermana Zacarías, the Rivera sisters, Margarito Bautista, Eduardo Valderas, Fernando and Ketita Gomez, and maybe some modern-day members of a Zapatista Mormon battalion to put down their guns and pick up the pen or laptop and write about their people. To end, I would say that each and every one of our communities, there are stories to be told that go beyond what's been done to us and speak to how our people have navigated the space they've chosen to be part of. I'm heartened by all of you because you've accepted the call to tell the stories. And I know there will be strength to each of us because of it. And we will leave with a greater desire to learn more about what makes us or our people call themselves Lamanite. And let me just add, as I sat there this morning and saw all the feelings and passions and stories of our personal journeys, I realized that it's a very complicated, and my story fits a small group within a small group, that those that I grew up with happened to empower me. And so for me, it was empowering in term without ever denying all the other things that were attached to it, or even the stories. In my ward, we became good at skipping over stuff about us being savages and just going to the fact that we were winning wars or we were the most dedicated or whatever. Or of course, Samuel, all of us knew Samuel the Lamanite. And I think I memorized everything he said about them. And then the favorite scripture about Jacob coming as a lion to tear into those Gentiles who were not faithful. But I know this is complicated. And so I am learning from you. And I hope that I've added a little bit to tell one other element of this larger story, which is painful, complicated, contradictory, but it is what it is because that's who we are or were or have been or should be or never have wanted to be, but is there. Thank you.